So, welcome to day 5 of the Southam Virtual Book Festival. I thought I'd talk for a few minutes about the sort of work that I do, and then I'll open it up for questions. If you want to ask questions at any time, it's a small group, so you can sort of just butt in via the audio if you want. So I'm not muting anybody because it's such a small group. Let me just ask Adam to unmute so I know you can actually talk. So you can ask questions live, or just if you're a bit shy, just send them in via the chat and we'll get cracking. So what I thought I'd do first is, one of the things I'm working on at the moment is, it's actually a dictionary I'm repairing for a chap in America. He's had it since his school days in, I think it's dated 1955 when he got it. So that makes the book 65 years old, so I'm guessing he's about 80-ish. I'm just going to share the screen and show you a picture of what it looked like before I started. Okay, so this is what it looked like when I got it. So as you can see, the spine is just falling off, the stitching is all coming undone, the pages are all tattered and torn, and it's, yeah, you could say it's a bit of a mess. So what I agreed with them was that I'd strip the book down completely, resew it, put a new back onto it. But one of the things he asked me could do is there any way to actually take this paper off? Can you guys see my mouse moving or not?
Yeah, yes.
Okay, cool. This is very soft paper, which is actually quite difficult to take off, but I had a cunning plan to remove that, which I'll come to later on. So first thing to do was strip it down completely, unstitch it, take all the glue off the back, and then repair all the pages really. So if you remember, this is what the last few pages look like, and this is what they look like before I sewed it. So it's all tidied up. But what we do is we repair this with what we call Japanese kozo paper. So it's very thin tissue paper, which is made from the bark of the mulberry tree, which is very thin, but the fibers are very long and incredibly strong. So it means you can make a virtually invisible repair to it. So there are quite a few. I must have repaired about 40 torn pages in this. It's quite a mess, but very well thumbed. So the next bit was to do some stitching. So to reinforce it, to protect, to basically stop the stitching going through the paper, we sew it onto tapes. So the stitching goes through the paper around the back and along, but not actually through the tape. So we can basically move the tape and squish it down, if you like. As you can imagine, there are nearly 1,200 pages in this, so that took me about 4 hours to sew that. And this is it completed, ready to have it backed. So squeeze it up tight and form a nice little sort of mushroom shape over there. Next stage is to put what we call a canvas mull. So this is a sheet of canvas which is glued to it, and this will stick onto the covers to bind it on. And then these tapes as well will also be stuck to the covers to provide strength, because it's quite a heavy book. And then we put a piece of thin card over the top to just protect it all. This is preparing the case for it. So you've got to make sure that the book cloth is wide enough. You make a spacer to put in between the main covers. Everything is lined up to make sure it's all square. This thing that it's sitting on is actually the red book cloth, which you'll see in a moment. And then, so this is the tapes and the mull that I showed you before, and it's actually sticking the first half onto the cover. And this is the second one ready to flip up and over onto it. Okay, I've also put big books want a headband on it. Now this is what normally when you pull a book off the shelf, you pull the spine, and to protect the spine from ripping the spine head and tail, we put a stitched headband onto it. It looks pretty as well. And that's what's a picture of the final book. So the actual thing itself is here. So let's find my camera first. So that's the actual book done.
Gosh.
Colour's not showing up really well in this, is it? So, and what I managed to do is I can manage to remember that being on the inside of the cover. What I did, because the paper was very soft, instead of trying to lift the paper off, I actually delaminated the card, cut into it with a knife and peeled the card off layer by layer until I just had the paper left. A bit painstaking, but because it's got his school, I've got school dates and his signature and everything on it. So yeah, I'm hoping he'll be quite pleased with that. It's quite a good one to repair because you can see it's got all the finger holes in it. So if you don't get it accurately lined up, that tends to look a mess. But it's worked, and I'm quite pleased with that one. Next one I'm doing, I tend to get an awful lot of Bibles, doing this. The next one I'm doing is, let's see, it's called an interlinear Bible. And this one, it's typically what happens with Bibles. You get the spine starting to come away. Because it's been so well used, you can see that the stitching is coming apart, and you can see it pulling away. This Bible's been in use since 1992, and she does Bible study every day. So you can see that every page is just full of these annotations, which is marvelous. So it's, she didn't want to buy a new one just because there's so much work gone into compiling this. Another thing that tends to happen with these things is that, the stitching actually, I don't know if you can see, this has got to come up, the stitching actually pulls through the paper and rips the paper, which tends to happen with these. Because the paper is so thin, it's very delicate. So as the spines work loose, the more it gets used, the more damage you create. So this one is going to be a candidate for repair. So what I'm going to have to do when I repair that one, so a candidate for restitching. So what I'm going to have to do with that one is I'm going to have to, I don't know how much you know about books, but books when they're made in what we call sections. So you normally have 8 sheets of paper which are folded together, and then you stitch through 8 sheets at a time. So each one of those sections is going to need a strip of the Kozo paper put on the back. And I'll have to introduce stitching where there aren't any holes. So basically stagger it in between where the tears are. So that's going to take quite a while, but it's worth it because she wants that preserving. The third one I'm working on is a nice little gem of a book. It's just over 200 years old. It's what we call a fine binding, so it's covered in calf leather. Unfortunately, I don't know if you can see this, but leather tends to suffer from what we call red rot, and you can see along the spine here it starts to break up and it turns red, and it just crumbles away into dust. But because it's been passed down the family through generations, what we're going to try and do is preserve the look and feel of the leather. So I'm going to very carefully lift the leather off, and then put a new spine over it out of leather, and then stick the old leather on top of it. And then to stop the rot, as they say, this chemical called Clucel G, which is designed specifically for stopping the rot and firming up the fibres of the leather. And then we put a leather balm onto it to make the leather flexible again. Don't get too many tongue twisters, but there you go. Okay, so that gives you an idea of the sort of things I'm working. Oh, there's another one as well. This one's also from this chap in the States. He's got a copy of volume 1, number 1 of it's called The Two Worlds Monthly. And this is a really valuable edition because it's got like I say, it's volume 1, number 1 of an unauthorized serialized printing of James Joyce's Ulysses from 1926. So he didn't actually get permission to do this. So there's a big copyright fight about it. So books like this are quite valuable because it's unauthorized and low volume printing. So one thing you don't repair books like that, because any attempt to repair it devalues the book. So what he's asked me to do in this case is to make a protective box for it, because at the moment it's just floating around in bubble wrap, and taking it in and out, eventually it will get damaged. So what I'm going to do for that is make a clamshell box for it. I don't know if you know what a clamshell box is, but
no.
Look like this. There you go.
Oh.
So basically, it'll be made to fit, quite snugly into it. Just give it a millimetre or two all the way around, and then I'll cushion the spine here so that when it folds over, it holds it nice and snug in the case. Okay, so that's a flavour of the sort of things I'm working on at the moment. Anybody want to kick off with any questions, or got things you'd like me to look at?
I had a question in my head then. So, Brian, you obviously had to do some training to get to know how to do all of this. Was that a very long experience, or how did that work? I guess I started doing this, about 4 or 5 years ago, when basically I was the firstborn son in our family inherits the family Bible, and it goes back to, I think it's 1825, and it's a big sort of really thick, leather bound, nicely tooled thing. But from the way my mum was keeping it, it was falling apart, and I wanted to restore it, but I didn't want to go to another book restorer to actually spend hundreds of pounds on it. And so I started, doing online courses and looking at videos and just slowly learning, teaching myself. And then I was quite pleased with that repair. Then I went on to try a couple of other books that I've had, and then friends and family started asking me to do stuff, and then I signed up for more online courses. And then what I have been doing over the past couple of years is there's a master bookbinder down in Salisbury that I've been working with, and I attend regular workshops with her, and I think she has about 10 or 12 bookbinders at a session, and we all get together. We're all at different levels of skill. Some people are good at one thing, some people are good at another. So as well as Laurie teaching us her skills, we're actually teaching each other our tips and tricks and techniques and things. So what advice can you give us, Brian, about looking after books? Because most of us have got precious books that we need to want to keep. What's your advice about looking after books, or generally using books?
It depends on the weight of the book and the state that it's in. So, I mean, generally, if it's a heavy book, try not to pull it off the shelf by doing that, because that's gonna rip the tops. When you're laying a big heavy book down, don't put it down flat and open it one bit at a time and skip through. Open it from the middle so it distributes the weight, and then flick your way through to the page that you want. If it's fragile, keep it somewhere safe. I mean, there are some which are really heavy.
I'll bring it to you.
Well, yeah, I mean, we can go on to that in a minute, but basically, if you have got a valuable book and you're standing it up on a bookshelf, you can actually put something underneath that, because if it's just resting on there, you see, if you do that, the text block actually falls through, and that will eventually weaken the spine. So if it's a really valuable book, store it flat. But if you must have it on a bookshelf, have something underneath, a bit of card just to support the weight of it. Dry environment, so don't keep it in the garden shed, obviously. Dust them from time to time. If you think it is a valuable book, get someone to value it for you. If you are happy using the internet, I don't think there anybody who isn't these days. There's a lovely site called Abe Books, abebooks.co.uk. I can see some nods. But basically, every time I've seen a book and I wanted to sort of just check how valuable it was before repairing it, I've yet to not find a copy on Abe Books. I mean, their search engine's a bit iffy, but if you try a few different variations, you can generally get a copy. And it's nice to sort of validate your opinion of a book to see, at what point did you say that's worth so much that you shouldn't repair it. So I think if you go on Abe Books and you think you've got a copy that's worth a few £100, then it's worth going to an antiquarian bookshop and asking them to sort of validate what you think it might be worth, and then you can decide, no, I'm not going to have that repaired. Or you might turn around and say, no, it's only worth about 30, 40 quid, in which you might want to get it repaired. But if in doubt, get it checked out first. But I tend to focus on those books that aren't of historical value, the sort of things that the National Trust would have, where you want to go to a proper conservator who basically spend hundreds and hundreds of pounds on a book. I tend to focus on those books that are of more personal value. So, like my family Bible, or books that have been passed down the generations. So they have emotional value, if you like. Like, for instance, I did one a few weeks ago for a lady who it was a book of fairy tales, and it was hers as a child, but it had been damaged, the covers had come off it, and when she was 12, she'd actually made her own cover for it with, nicely illustrated with hearts and nicely lettered and things. And so what I said, do you want me to actually take your cover and incorporate it into the binding, and then I'll put a hard case around that, which we did, and she was thrilled with it. But I think the main thing for me is it's making the book readable again. So in other words, you can read it without fear of it getting damaged. There's one I did a couple of years ago, which was what was it called? It was Tales from the Highlands and Islands. It's a collection of Scottish stories. Again, the book was a couple of 100 years old. And my client was in her 80s, and it was her grandfather's book. And again, it was a huge tome, really heavy. And he would sit there on an evening, smoking his pipe and drinking whiskey. And more often than not, he'd fall asleep. The book would fall off his lap onto the floor, damage. But yeah, she told me some lovely stories about that. But that was a pleasure to repair it.
One of our most battered books was a copy of Mrs. Beeton, which I bought when we first got married in about 1961. And it's really fat.
Yep.
And in many ways, it's totally impractical for the purpose, because you needed to be turning pages and opening and looking for recipes. I've got that stuck together with tape, not very beautifully, but it can still be used. Yes.
Tape is anathema to the bookbinder, because if it's sellotape, once it starts to yellow, the glue decomposes and it actually sinks into the paper, and once that happens, you can't get it out. Unless you've got some really expensive chemicals.
You've got quite a lot of kit there, Brian. What's your most useful piece of kit that you use?
Oh, goodness. It's all useful. Probably the thing that gets used the most. I mean, the main thing is having really, really sharp knives, especially if you're working with leather. So when you're sort of binding with leather, the thinnest leather you can buy is usually about 1 millimeter thick, but generally you want it
at least half of that thickness. So there's two things I've got. One is it's a modified spoke shave, but the blade is slightly curved so that the corners don't dig in. And what I find is that you can spend half an hour to an hour grinding it and getting it razor sharp. And then once you've done that, as long as you've got a decent strop, you can actually go for weeks and weeks without having to sharpen it. And you can actually, it's that sharp, I can actually just run it along and it'll just get a shaving of leather off. Like you would if you're using a plane on a piece of wood. You just get nice thin strips of leather off. So that's probably the one single most important thing you can do is make sure you've got sharp knives. Same with a paring knife, because on the edge of the leather, you want the leather to be sort of tapered very thin, so that when you come to fold it around the boards, you want it paper thin. And so with a paring knife, if you've got it sharp enough, you can literally just run straight up and get it up in one go. It takes a lot of skill and practice to get to that stage, but once I learned how to sharpen knives properly, I thought, this is so easy. so much easier than the first few weeks when you're scraping away and just getting dust up. It just, you just can't have knives that are sharpened. But that's, there are tools that make life easy. So for instance, one of the most accurate things you need to be able to do when you're binding a book is putting book cloth onto, folding it around the card. So I don't know if you can see on here, but basically you have about sort of 10-15 millimeters of cloth, which will fold in round this way first and then fold over the top. But because the board is a certain thickness, you've got to cut the diagonal off in exactly the right place. Otherwise, you either get a lump or you get a gap. And so there's there's a corner cutting guide which offsets. It's got like a shape like that, and it offsets the cutting point by the thickness of the board plus 0.5 millimeter from there. And as long as you use that, you get the cutting in exactly the right place. Now, these tools have been quite expensive. They're normally made of metal and machined, and they can be 50, 60, 70 pounds a piece. But there's a very innovative chap in Holland who's got one of these 3D printers, and he's actually started printing bookbinding equipment. And so, for instance, I got a set of 4 corners for £24 from him. I've just got, for making cases, have these lovely little clamps which guarantee that you get the corners absolutely 90 degrees square really accurately, rather than having to sort of just guess at it or wedge things up. So yeah, little tools like that, because it's 3D printed. Once he's got the model for it, you just press the button and churn it out. So it's really, really cost effective. And the one thing that every bookbinder needs is a set of presses. So there's the finishing press, which is the traditional, the big heavy metal one that you crank around to sort of press things heavily. There's also the line press, which, let me just go back to my thing a minute. So let's just go. So this puppy, so this is basically, it's made of beech, and it's basically made for holding the book while you're working on them. For smaller books, it can just sit on the bench. For bigger books, you have what's called a cradle to hold it up. Well, these generally cost a couple of £100, but actually I got a beech block kitchen fitted a few years ago, and I had some leftovers. So I thought, I'll have a go at making one myself, and yeah, it actually turned out really well. So saved myself a couple of £100 there. I mean, I have to say that my father was a cabinet maker, and as a kid he taught me how to do all the woodwork and things. So I've got a shed full of his tools and things. Slightly easier, but
you've got a head start.
Yeah. I like to consider myself as a fairly practical person.
I can hear you talking, Louise, but I can't. I can see you talking, but I can't hear you.
All right.
Have you got a volume?
Yeah, let me turn you up.
That's better.
That's better, yeah.
Right, okay. I'll take my headphones off now. I was going to ask you, have you had a favourite book that you've dealt with? And is it what was it your favourite because of the contents of the book, or because of the stories that you heard about as a result of dealing with the customer?
That's an interesting question. There was one author who was at last year's book festival. What was her name? Marilyn Pemberton.
Pemberton, yes.
Yeah, and she'd written a book. No, she'd written a book about the author of
Oh, I know.
Princess Fioramundi's Necklace, it was called. It's basically a book of fairy tales, but she'd written a book about the author of it, and she had one of the first edition copy of it, which was falling apart because when she gives her talks, she'd hand it round and it's all battered and torn. And we agreed it wasn't of any commercial value because the spine was completely missing. So I sort of repaired that for her, put a new spine onto it. But the font wasn't a standard font on the back. It was almost like a handwritten font. And so I thought, how am I going to reproduce this? And so what I actually did, I found a copy online of the book and saved an image of the spine. I then took that into Photoshop and basically brushed out everything apart from the lettering, and then sort of got the magnification just right for the size of the book. Wasted a lot of paper doing that to get exactly the right size. And then I actually printed it onto the book cloth itself in a very faint colour, and then so I could actually letter it by hand using gold to reproduce the original spine as close as I could. So that was an interesting technique.
I bet she was thrilled with it, wasn't she?
Oh yes, yeah. Any other favourites? Gosh, you do get some interesting books. Yes, there was one which was again, it was a family Bible, but when you can get big leather Bibles that have the brass frame all around them and sort of the big metal clasps that come up. Had one of those, and it had been dropped, and the frame was all bent and twisted and buckled, and it was more of a metalwork repair than a bookbinding repair. But and that was a real challenge for me, because normally those sort of frames, they're actually screwed into the case, because the case is quite often very thin wood as opposed to card. And so, but the chap who'd done it, he hadn't actually screwed it in. He'd actually got tiny rivets and riveted it in. And you can't take those out. So I had to come up with a rather bizarre jig that held the metal and allowed me to sort of tap against it. You can't say it, basically tap against it as I'm working on the metal to sort of get it to shape again. But yeah, that was a challenge. But yeah, I've not done one like that before. I like to rise to a challenge.
Thank you. And what about stories wise, in terms of the customers? Have you got a really, I mean, you were talking about the grandfather that dropped the Bible, but have you got any others like that? Because I think for me, in your line of work, that is as interesting as actually doing the job, isn't it? It's why a customer wants that work done.
Yeah, it's the story behind it. Like that lady who had her book as her children's fairy tale book, things like that. There was a chap a few weeks ago who's he leads a Bible study group. He's with the Christadelphians, and in fact it was an identical Bible to the one I've just showed you earlier on. And every single page again was annotated, and he'd had this most of his adult life, and so it contained all his thoughts and all his notes for when he's going out doing his Bible study talks, and he travels around the country doing it. He seems to be quite senior in their church. So it's, for him, it was invaluable. But he got in touch with me on Friday afternoon, and he was giving a big talk on the Tuesday, and he said, "Is there any way you can get this done for me?" And so I actually managed to sort of fix it over the weekend and get it back to him before he went off to do his lecture. Fortunately, that one didn't need resewing. That was quite a repair.
There'd be some fast drying glue involved in that then, I should think.
Yeah, I mean, that's, you think, one of the big things with repairing books is the amount of time you spend just waiting, because with a lot of repairs, you do a repair, you glue it, you wait for it to dry, you glue the next bit, you wait for it to dry. So generally you have several books on the go as you're doing it. You might say, yes, so for instance, I might charge somebody 10 hours work for a book, but it won't be ready in 10 hours time, it will be ready in 2 weeks time. That sort of thing.
I noticed when I watched your video that you used several different kinds of glue. Can you tell us a bit about that, please?
There's two main types. There's paste and there's glue. So generally you tend to use paste on the, there's paste which you tend to use on paper, and also on anything where you need to spend time adjusting it, because there's glue, there's paste, which is basically flour and water, or sometimes you can cheat and use wallpaper paste because it's got an anti-mold ingredient in there, and as long as it's acid neutral, then it's safe to do that. Oh, excuse me. And then the other glue we tend to use is PVA. Again, we use an archival PVA, so it will last for decades in the book. But you have to be careful with it, because I did get a batch of glue a while ago, which was clear PVA, which I'd not seen before. I thought, oh, this is interesting. And I put it onto a book I was doing, and it actually dries really brittle. And so when I came to sort of bend the spine of the book, it just cracked.
Oh, gosh.
And so, well, we're using that one again. Fortunately, that was one of mine, not our customers. But yeah, I think I did do a Mrs. Beaton book myself, personally. So
you know what I'm talking about.
There's a fundamental design flaw in those books, because that when they started binding those, the concept of the open spine hadn't been invented, and so the spine is glued to the back of the book, and because it's open so much, it will crack. Every single copy of Mrs. Beaton's book I've seen that's been used is just split down the middle, either partially or completely. So you know what I mean by the open spine. So it's basically it's like that. So you can bring it to the back of it, and that's, since that was invented, books have lasted a lot longer. Whereas with the older ones, like this one, so it's actually stuck to it, and time it goes. It's a shame. It's interesting to see how the designs of book manufacturing change over time. Different techniques come up, people develop new ideas.
What's the oldest book that you've done, Brian?
The oldest one will be I've actually got it here, actually. Samuel Johnson. It's a tiny little thing. This was, this was published in 1807. It's the poetical works of James Thomson, with the life of the author. So yeah, it's tiny little thing, but it's one of my books, and basically the spine, like the other one, this was just completely crumbling, so I basically took it off, put a new piece of leather around it, and then put a new one back onto it.
When you buy a book, Are you ever tempted to buy just for the binding and the spine and the beautiful exterior of the book?
Oh heavens, yes, yeah. I was actually in, where was it? Was it in Sainsbury's in Leamington last year, and they have basically a stand of second-hand books that people are just giving away, and it's like an honesty box thing. You put 50p and you take one out. And I saw this copy. It was the binding that stuck out. So it was green and gold. I thought, that looks interesting. And it was a German book. It was written in sort of the classical German, lovely font, by the way. Your German font's about 150 years old. But the binding was absolutely gorgeous. So I just bought it for that. As it turned out, it was worth about £40. So whoever gave it away obviously didn't know that.
Good save.
But you get that. Or I saw a book once. It had a yellow and brown binding on it. But when I got it, I don't know if you know, but when books are made, they don't print single pages. They print a whole sheet, which can be either 8 pages at a time or 16 pages at a time. And it's a real art to make sure you get the page sequence in the right order. But this book had been bound, but hadn't actually been cut. So some of the pages were still folded and hadn't been opened up ready for reading. It's quite rare to come across something like that. But when I was Googling it, it's actually turned out that this particular publisher of a printer of this particular book, he did that. They basically just churned them out, and that part of the process they'd forgotten to cut it before sending them out. But yes, it's the binding I'm more attracted to than the actual content usually, especially a leather-bound book that's got gorgeous tooling on it, or it's got leather inlay. I mean, there are what you call fine bindings, where it's a whole art form. So I'm a member of the Society of Bookbinders, but there's a Society of Fine Binders, and they're the ones who, it's more book arts, if you like. It's the art of the book, the art of making it an unusual binding. And what they tend to do, they tend to sort of do work for like people who've artists or people who've done a set of illustrations, and the artist wants that set of illustrations preserved as their originals, but kept safe in a fine binding. So they'll spend hundreds and hundreds of pounds on getting one of these made, but that then becomes really valuable in future.
Hi, Brian. Can I ask a question? Apologies first that I wasn't visible at the beginning. I've been double booked in the house, so I had to move to another place. I just wonder whether you get nervous sometimes doing some of these, because you talk particularly where you're not just dealing with a book, you're dealing with somebody's sort of history and their I suppose there's a whole emotional weight to it. I think I watched the video, which is great and really useful for someone who's just starting out doing this sort of stuff, but I think you said like that bit where you're going to fold the end papers over, and there's a moment where you go, is it going to stick in the right place? And I wonder how you get over that. Obviously, it's through practice and through time, but whether there are moments where you're sort of on a bit of a knife edge with it.
that is the one moment that's the one part of the process where if you don't get it right, it can be hard to undo it. And there is a technique for doing that. If I've got anything I can show you with, I don't particularly want to do it with one of these. I'll try this one. So basically, you remember the picture where we had this open and this bit wasn't stuck. So basically, it's putting the text block on. So bear with me 10 seconds.
Gone.
So you're teaching yourself, Adam, now?
I am, yes. I've done a little bit with, I've done some sort of casework. So I've been buying some book blanks and making nice notebooks. And I've done a little bit, I went to a sort of just a day course doing a bit of sewing. So I've done some stitching and done some flat books, but it feels like a whole other ball but game to then go and like strip and repair a book, particularly if it's at the moment I've got one that my father-in-law has given me and said, oh, will you be able to do that? It's like, Well, I could, but it feels like it's quite a nerve-wracking thing to do, and
Well,
it's knowing whether do you even need to strip it, or actually can you just recase it? It's those sort of big questions, really.
It's practice. So
Yes,
you go to second-hand bookshop and just buy a load of books. Do you know the book barn out at
Ashley, do you mean?
Thank you. Yes, you know the book barn there. So they've got the 50 bob barn,
right?
The 5 bob. Yeah, the 50p part, 50p bit. And I went in there and I got a whole crate of books, 50p a piece, and that's how I started practicing repairing them, because these were books from a collection which were pre-war, so they were pretty old. None particularly valuable, or there were some that were worth 10 or 20 quid. So you can find some little bargains in there. But actually, what I'm going to show you, this is one that I'm just partway through doing myself. So this one, it's sewn, but it needs to be rounded and backed. So you know what I mean by rounding and backing?
Yeah, I haven't done it, but I know what you mean. Yes.
So basically, you're going to squeeze that between the backing boards, and then you're going to sort of round it. I'm trying to hold this high up. So basically, you round it, and then it forms like a little mushroom. And then you knock these bits over to the width of the board that you're going to do it to, so that hangs over it, and that's what forms the safe hinge and protects it. But when you're doing the actual board, so sticking it onto the board, the first one is dead easy because you can line it up and make sure you've got a really good square around it. Okay. The hard bit is when you're lifting the second bit over it, and that's the bit where it can go wrong. So the important thing is, once you've got that square, then you have a piece. Imagine this is the rest of the case. So you make sure this is held down with a heavy weight, and then you hold it up, push it up with your fingers like that, put another weight on top, and make sure it's very carefully squished down, and basically you're pushing it away from you as you're doing it.
Right.
And if you do that nice and slowly, and don't fret about it, and then you can just check, is it lined up? You sight it to make sure it's lined up. As long as you're using paste, if you're not lined up, you can take it off again. But generally, you'll cause damage if you do that. Lots of mistakes that some people make is they'll do it, and then they'll lift it up to look to see if it's in the right place, and that will cause damage along there. Right. So what the most important, you can lift it, maybe that much, but if you did that, look at it. But yeah, so basically, it's that technique of sliding it up evenly along the spine, and then once you've got your fingers around the corner, then lay it down carefully.
And pushing it away almost, you say?
Yeah, so it's just keeping that pressure up. I keep doing it where you can't see. Just keeping that pressure up and pushing it along that does it. Okay. But yeah, the first time I did that, I didn't get it right. And yes, it's practice.
I think it's lovely how you do incorporate the individual's elements as well. I think it's not just about rebinding something as well. I think that you can actually incorporate the original materials, and I think you've shown on one where they got the library ticket and the school prize and stuff as well. I think that's really nice and quite innovative and creative in its own way, isn't it? It's not just following the manual, I suppose. That's the thing.
Well, because I mean, there's never just one way of doing it. There are, depending on what the problem is, the different techniques. So, for instance, generally, you would stick. When I showed you before, you got your tapes, and then you put your mull over the top, and generally that sticks to the inside of the case, and then you put the end paper on top of it. Sometimes when you get a really heavy book or a thick book, one technique to use is you have the mull going over it, but instead of going, if you want to preserve the end paper and you can't get it off like I was able to do on the other one, what you can do is actually cut into the board itself using a paring knife,
And as long as you can get it in the middle and cut about 10 millimeters down, and then you can actually get the mull into that. And then once you've glued it, it's not visible from either side.
Okay.
But to do that, basically, you don't do it with one sheet. You do it with two. So basically, you'd have just get some scraps of paper here. So you'd have, say, one piece going over like that, say like that, and then the other side you'd have another piece going over like that. So the two stick together, and that becomes nice and tight. Yeah. So you stick it into the case on one side, you stick it into the case on the other side, and then you attach them on like that.
Right.
If that makes sense.
Yes, yeah. I'm trying to get you big on the screen. I've got all of us on there at the moment, so I can see everybody.
What thread do you have to use, Brian? Is it
Sorry?
Thread? What sort of thread do you use for stitching it or the book all together?
That depends on the book. So if it's a heavy book and it's fairly thick paper, then you use one particular weight. So anybody who knows sewing, you know that the threads.
Yeah, we know sewing. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot that reminds me of sewing, the mitering and so on. But yeah.
So there's generally it's a 3-core thread, and the weight is used specifically for the book. But what you have to be careful is if you pick the wrong thickness of thread, it will alter the fatness of the spine, and you could end up with a book where instead of being even like that, the spine is actually quite a lot fatter there than it is at the front of the book, because the thread is still piled up on it each cell.
What's the thread made of? Is it cotton or is it a synthetic thread?
It's usually cotton.
Yeah.
I mean, there are different variations, and some people use like a flax thread. Then if you get into sort of the more book restoration conservation, then there are specific threads and cords that you can buy. But I tend to use a company called Hewitt's, which are based up in Scotland, and they sell pretty much everything without it being ridiculous prices.
Yeah.
So yeah, Adam, it's worth checking them out I don't know if you're aware of them. But they're a good source, and they generally turn stuff around pretty quickly as well. Then of course you can have, as well as the normal, I mean, you want to try and pick the thread to be sympathetic with when the book was made.
Right.
If you're doing a repair, obviously if you're doing a new binding, a new book, then it's just whatever your client wants or whatever you feel like using. But generally it's just I tend to use a natural colour rather than a dyed colour.
Yeah.
Unless you're sewing a headband. If you're sewing a headband, these things. There's two ways of doing that. You can either buy it ready sewn, which is stuck onto a piece of canvas, which you can glue in, but that tends to be more decorative. Or there is a technique for actually sewing the thread in. Basically, you've got 2 needles and 2 threads, which you're going around a few times, then going around a few times and knotting it. And there's lots of different styles of knotting it. I mean, there's a whole book written just on how to do different styles of head binding. And you might want to give this a try at some point, Adam, but it's a bugger to get your head around it.
I like the stick-on version. I think that's probably for now. That's probably where I'm at.
But once you've done your first one and it works, you think, I feel good about that.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Yeah.
I'm sure you get a lot of satisfaction out of a job well done, and
it is because it started off as a hobby for me, and just did it for my own pleasure, and I love learning anyway. And when you get to the point where people are happy to pay you to do what you enjoy doing, what better job can you have?
Can't be bad, can it?
That's good. Excellent. Well,
Can I ask a slightly technical question? Is that all right? I think at the beginning of your video, you talked about sort of the different levels of sort of repair required, I think, and there was some where the pages were obviously falling out and obviously needed a full restitch. I wondered where, you don't, thinking like medically, you don't want to sort of intervene if you don't have to. And I wondered where if your spine's all right and it is just about recasing, how you might sort of do that and join it to either create a new case, or as you were sort of hinting with the mull earlier, whether on reusing the original covers and either replacing the spine section or something. I don't know if you could talk about that briefly.
Generally, if you can use the original case, then it's obviously looks a lot better.
Yeah.
It's also a lot easier if you can take the case off completely. Trying to repair a book. The one hard decision is if the end papers they're signed or they've got some provenance written on it, and by removing that, because generally if you're repairing a book, you write off the end papers, so you tear off the one that's not attached to the case, and if you're going to use the same one, you either leave it on or you try and soak it off. Sometimes if the paper's good enough quality, you can actually just put a damp cloth over it and the paper will eventually come off. It just depends on the sort of glue that's being used. The older the book, the more likely it is that you'll be able to get it off because of the animal glues that they use, particularly on the spine. So what you can do, a lot of the old glue is brittle and it will break off. But if it's not, then what you do is just mix some glue, stick it over the old glue, and that will soften the glue beneath. But it's not moist enough that it's actually going to soak into the paper.
Right.
So it will actually, it's very messy, and the old glues are really smelly as well. They're not nice. It's boiled horse, so.
Okay.
But yeah, so I'm not sure if I'm answering your question. So are you asking, should I preserve the original case or should I put a new one? Or... I
suppose it's how you make those decisions, and I guess if you decide, well, I guess if the book is intact, and often it's like, well, hang on, I'll show you what I've got. Yeah, if that's any use. I've got this book, which has got, I've got all the bits to it integral, but I've got 2 boards and I've got a spine.
Right.
So that's in 3 parts, but the book itself feels like it's all right. It feels like it's more trouble to pull it apart, I think, and probably cause more trouble to it.
Well, 9 times out of 10, you don't need to do that. The way to check is just open the spine on the first section and just see, can you see any daylight through the stitching?
Yes, yeah, and
if you can't, then you're okay.
Yeah, so obviously you don't have your little cloth bits then, but so you would just use a mull, would you, and just put that over the. So how do you fix it? I suppose because are you just relying on an end paper, or do you use a mull as well?
For a book that weight, I would use the mull. Just relying on end papers, you can only do that for really light books.
Right. Okay.
If you don't use a mull, then it's not going to have any life in it.
I suppose it's that anxiety about not having, you look in the manual and you've got your tapes and you're following a process and you think, well, where am I coming in the process here? And it's like, and can you do that? Is it all right to not attach it with tapes or whatever, really? But,
yeah, it just depends. I mean, is yours sewn onto cords?
No, it's on. It looks like there's sort of 3 tapes probably buried underneath there somewhere. There's a bit of glue to get off, but it feels like it's pretty sort of. There's a smooth sort of rounding.
Yeah. I mean, if the tape is visible, you might be able to sew a tape extension onto it.
Right. Sort of tuck it into where the stitching is, I suppose.
Yeah, that might be one way of doing it. But I think if you just use the mull, when you're making the case, the most important thing is to make sure that what's holding it together, because you're in 3 separate bits, You
Yes,
want to
yeah.
make sure that the cases have the exact dimensions. And so what I suggest you do is you align your, so get your board aligned up so you've got the square. You know, when I say the square is what you can see visible around there.
Yes, yeah.
Get it lined up, put the second case on the top, get it lined up, and then what you want to do is just get a bit of paper that goes from the edge of the case, fold it round, and just do a crease at the edge of each board. And then you can, excuse me, you can use that as a guide to make sure you can then basically you make a piece of card the right width.
Right.
You know that picture I showed you earlier on. Which way was it? It was this way. So this one. So basically, what I did for this is my filler piece here, and I took a piece of paper and folded it around from where the edge of the board is. You know, on the outside of a book, you get the indentation, which is the hinge.
Yes, yeah.
Basically,
yeah.
you took it in from that, and you cut the piece of card to be exactly that width. That way, you know that the spine is going to be in the right place, because there's nothing worse than doing a book and you've got a sloppy spine, or you do it too thin and it won't actually close.
Right. Okay. No, that makes sense. Yes.
Yeah. But the fact that you've got the two boards and the spine are completely detached, it just makes life so much easier.
All right. Okay. I thought it was more difficult, but no, if that's easier then.
No, it is good. Trying to do it when one's still attached, it is a lot harder. You can get it exactly right before you actually stick it back on again.
And you wouldn't sort of put a sort of another section of linen behind it or something to sort of reinforce, or
so put your mull on it, and then put some craft paper on it. The thin card. Yeah.
Okay.
You don't want it to be too thick, because obviously that's going to stop it bending. You want it to be able to have that nice flow where it bends. It doesn't stay rigid.
Okay. Right. Okay. I'll have a go. Let you know how I get on. Thank you. That's really helpful.
That's fine. But if you're worried about doing your dad's book and making a mistake, get another cheap one and practice first.
Yeah. No, that's a good idea.
Brian, it's been lovely to hear, your obvious passion for your job as well as the techniques that you use. I think that's really lovely.
Yeah, I tend to get my enthusiasm gets you carried away, and I can just waffle on.
That's really good.
And I think one of the other things that it seems to me that you need is care and patience,
and also it's attention to detail. So you think through the repair before you do anything. Yeah. Because quite often you'll but then even with the best of intentions, you can start to repair, get part way through, and think, I wasn't expecting that, and then you have to sort of change your approach completely. Because sometimes you can start strip a book down and you find all sorts of weird and wonderful things inside it, and think, why the hell did they do that? Like one book I repaired recently, it's got every you got the 8-page sections, but in between every section they glued on 2 extra pages in between every section. And it's basically it's basically the glue. It's called tipping in. So they glue 3 to 5 millimeters of the page, and normally you do this at the back and the front of a book for a few extra book pages where there isn't enough to make a whole section. But this book had 2 pages glued in between every section.
Goodness.
Yeah, I thought, what? There's more sections, and my guess is that the printer actually got it messed up and got the things out of sequence, and that's why they had to do that. I don't know, but that's my guess anyway.
That's probably a costly mistake, I think.
Well, yes, the time it must have taken to do all that.
Well, I think, Brian, we're almost out of time. If there's any last questions.
Love your cat. What's his name?
She's like a baby.
If you've got any questions or anything you want to just discuss, you're not sure about, feel free to email me or give me a shout. My contact details are on the Bookfest website.
That's wonderful. Thank you. And that's really, really helpful, really informative. And the video was great as well. That was a
Video
really
was
good
really
setup.
good.
Very good,
Yeah.
Thank you. Because I had lots of people helping me when I was just starting out, so it's nice to be able to put that.
No, thank you. That's very generous. Thank you very much. Yeah, I will be in touch.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you for
Yes.
a fascinating session.
Thank you for sharing it all.
Yes, and thank you for everybody for contributing. I think you deserve. I think you deserve a glass of wine or a cup of tea or whatever you fancy now, Brian.
Tea and chocolate biscuit, I think.
A chocolate biscuit, yes, a good reward.
All right. Well, thank you for listening to me.
Thank you.
That's great. Thank you. Thanks for organising.
Really
and hosting.
And hopefully see some of you tomorrow. I think Louise is down for tomorrow.
Andrew Davis.
Yes, yeah, your name down, yes. Yeah. Okay. Hopefully we should have a good session tomorrow.
Okay. Thanks very much, Sam.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye. Nice
Thank
to
you, Brian.
meet you.